Psychology will define stress as, I'll read it, our reaction to a stimulus that disrupts our personal or our physical, our mental equilibrium. The definition shows us that stress is something that is within us. Notice the definition calls it our reaction to some sort of stimulus outside of our system. So that should give us an understanding of what stress is, but it should also give us some encouragement, because we know now that as it's something that is our reaction, we can learn to have a better and more proper reaction. Now, personally, I came up with Solomon's definition for stress years ago when I was going through a lot of stress in my life. And I defined stress as the difference between where I thought I should be or what I thought I should be getting done and what I was actually doing or what I actually had become. And I learned that if I could get those two things to be very similar in level, then my stress levels would go down. So there was two ways to address that: to better define my goals and my anticipations in any given circumstance, and also to be able to perform better or get closer to those goals. Once I could minimize that distance, then I felt like I was reducing the stress that I was experiencing. In Proverbs 12:25, we read, "Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad." So I'm glad this morning that I have an opportunity to be here and to guide you through a study on stress and how we can equip ourselves with some tools and prepare ourselves for stressful situations, so that that'll be our good word. That'll be what guides us, and we can shed a lot of our anxiety. The reality is that life is tough. I mean, we know that, and especially as we're progressing to the end of the age and things are clamping down on us, and the leeway, the flexibility that we feel is diminishing. We're feeling anxiety about what is to come, what we experience, what we feel as though we have to do today. And as that anxiety increases, it feels like we're getting banged around, doesn't it? I think when we go through a day, especially for those of us like my wife and I, who used to own and operate a business for almost 20 years. And that was a very stressful circumstance for us, because we were out there on the leading edge of what we had to do to provide a livelihood, not just for our own family, but for the employees that we had as well. So we found that to be a very stressful thing. But as we would go through the day, I mean, you would start out the day strong. You felt like you were ready to handle whatever was coming your way. But as that day went by and you got banged on and you ran into problems, ran into things, and your stress level would go up and you felt knocked around a little bit, you had to come up with ways to work through that in order to survive, because by the end of the day, you're going to have to put that all on the shelf and get ready for the next day. You'll have to forgive me, I'm a little bit of a football junkie, and I grew up in the 1990s, in that period in the 90s, where we had two running backs that were very successful in the National Football League. One was Barry Sanders. Anybody a Lions fan? Maybe a little bit. So Barry Sanders I used to call him an elegant runner, because he would dance and jive and juke, and nobody ever seemed to lay a glove on him, okay? On the contrast, Jerome Bettis was a favorite player of mine. Played for the Rams and went to the Steelers. And Jerome was huge. I used to call him the bus. And when the line would be, a defense would be ready for him, he would just plow through them. There was no stopping him. His momentum would just blow people out of his way. The reality is that gives us some ways of comparing how we handle the things that present themselves in our lives. Are we striving to bounce and get around them, avoid them, or do we just plow through them? A lot of times life gives us circumstances where we have no choice but to plow right into our problems. So let's plow into our study today. The reality is that we have a number of ways that we usually approach stress. For many people, the thing to do is to avoid it. I don't know if you ever watched a television show Seinfeld, but there was that episode where George's father was always stressed out, of course, and he came on this program called Serenity Now. And every time he hit a stressful situation, he would just say, "Serenity Now," and it made him feel better. And then Kramer started doing it. But what happened at the end? after avoiding stress for the whole episode, it all came crashing down on him at the end and he just lost it. And that's what happens to folks who try to avoid stress. It eventually will just come back and bite you. So you have to learn to work through it. The example that we think of the most when it comes to dealing with stress, sometimes dealing with stress, let me just take a step back. Dealing with stress is us almost in a state of denial because things are happening and we're getting torqued off about them and we're just like, I'm dealing with it, and you kind of deny that it's happening and you just keep working through it. Another way to approach stress is for us to employ coping mechanisms. And we'll talk a little bit about this at the end. Coping mechanisms are artificial things that we create in order to process stress that aren't truly helping us deal with the situation. And then finally, outside of that, we want to learn some tools and mechanisms for actually managing stress. That's our goal. So through the presentation today, I want to try to give you some tools for managing stress. The goal of creating tools is only going to be effective if we understand the sources of stress, or as I call them, stress factors, knowing what those stress factors are so we can identify them and then we can manage them. So if you notice in your booklets, I divided the stress factors into 3 groups. And we use the context of our homes. This is the Family Builders Conference, so our emphasis is on our homes. So let's look at 3 groups of stress factors: those that are outside the home, those that are inside the home, and then those that are internal, the things that are the most personal to us. Factors from outside the home can be our jobs, our employment, our finances, our time commitments, and school. I think as parents, we forget sometimes, and it's probably good that our teenage children have left the room because we can talk about them. But we forget sometimes that the stress factors that affect us are affecting our children as well. Not necessarily always the same ones, but while we might be worried about the family budget or the obligations we have at work, our children have equally valid and equally important things that are putting and exerting stress on them. So when we consider the factors that produce stress in our families from the outside, we have to include those considerations when we're thinking about them. Now, employment provides a stress for us. It's a necessary, I think Scott almost said necessary evil last night, but it's a factor of our society and it's a factor of reality of life that for our families to exist, we have to have a source of income. And that usually falls to the highly celebrated breadwinner, whoever that is, typically the father, outside of the home, who's bringing in the bulk of that income. Scott mentioned last night that many times our wives, our spouses, are also out there contributing to our income in the family. But our jobs can be a tremendous source of stress in our lives because in today's world, the desire, the pressure for efficiency is above anything that we've ever seen before. Our employers are asking us typically to do the work of 2 people because in the nature of the economy, they can't afford to put 2 people performing at an average level. They need 1 person performing at a superior level. So it forces a lot of stress onto us as employees to perform at this high level and meet the expectations of our employers. Finances are always a source of stress, and we do have to say that that's something from outside the home because in many ways our expectations, our expenditures are outside the home. But finances are always an issue. We never seem to have quite enough to make ends meet. No matter how much we have, if we have a little or if we have a lot, we really still have the same problem constantly. We're struggling to make ends meet, and it's a distraction to us, and it's that disparity between where we think we are and where we thought we would be. And the reality is we always have this high bar like, well, we're going to have enough money this year to replace the car. And then it gets to be like August, and you're like, we're never going to have enough money to replace the car. so I've got to go out there and get some repairs done. Things like that are always a source of stress within the home. Some of the stresses from outside of the home are things that we create ourselves by making overcommitments. And I think this is going to be addressed by some of the other presenters, but if we have ourselves locked into doing more than we humanly can possibly get done, then we're really widening that gap between the things that we thought we could do and the things we're able to do. And that's a great source of stress from outside the home. That can come from any number of sources. For someone like me, I work a full-time job. I'm what they call a vocational pastor. I work a full-time job, but I also try to make a full-time commitment to ministry. And that can be a lot of stress for me personally. And I know there's other men in here who do that, who serve the people of Yahweh while still trying to serve the needs of their family. But Elder James King last night mentioned the sports, extracurricular activities. Again, we want to do these things. The family wants to do them. They're entertaining. We find rewards in those, but yet the time availability is not always there. And the same thing goes with school. Our children are under a tremendous amount of stress because of the social pressure inside school. There's a lot of conformity that's put upon our children when they're with their friends at school. Again, that desire to be something and then falling short is causing stress on them. But sources of stress are not always just from outside the home. They're also very evidently from within the home. For example, I have 4 teenagers in my home, and I put down teenager issues, and I think anyone who's a parent, has been a parent, or has ever been a teenager will understand what I'm saying. Teenagers create a swirl of drama and stress inside of their own world, and that always spills out into the family. So the question is, how are you approaching that, and how are you managing through that? I mentioned dysfunctional relationships. Now, many times in our home, and I don't mean dysfunctional absolutely in the necessary context of being bad, but for some of us, we have been caretaking for a relative, a parent, a grandparent in the home, and that's something that creates a lot of need, and a lot of energy has to go towards that. That's not a functioning relationship, it's a dysfunctional relationship because you're putting more into it. There's no balance there. But dysfunctional relationships can be, your brother-in-law Poindexter who lost his job and is now living on your couch. That's a source of stress inside the home. I hope nobody has a brother-in-law named Poindexter. I figured if I said George, somebody's like, oh man, how do you know about our house? Anyway, we also see stress as a source within the home if there's a breakdown of what I call the cooperation matrix. That's a big word. I'm an engineer. Cooperation matrix. How about what we heard last night during the orientation, which I thought the orientation was, wow. I mean, the best part of last night's presentation, just learning about how to take the garbage out. But Elder Hector mentioned the need for us to have a team mentality. So if you see a need, you fill in that need. If you see someone who needs help, you try to help that person. Homemakers, which in the typical model is our spouse, our wife, they are working a set of tasks that I believe are more complex and more challenging than the things that we men do when we run off to go to our jobs, because our role is really defined and their role is all over the place. Any functioning home has to have this level of cooperation within the home. Mom cannot be the one who has to do everything. She can't be the one who has to pick up the dirty clothes from the floor, get them into the hamper, get them to the wash machine, get them washed, folded, and back into the dresser. She's not a maid. So as that process, and the teenagers and the husband occasionally will throw his dirty clothes on the floor, there's a breakdown of the cooperation matrix. The family's not working together. If one person is expected to do the work for everyone, it's not going to happen. And if the breakdown is leading to adding, amplifying the things that are going wrong, it's going to get worse a lot faster. So those are all things that are important, but really the reality is we need to really focus on the stress factors that are within us, because sometimes those are the ones that impact us the most. What do I mean by internal stress factors? In Psalm 119, in verse 165, the psalmist writes, "Great peace have they that know thy law." The law is Yahweh's guidance for us. It's the thing that lights our path. It's the thing that shows us the way that we should walk. So the psalmist here is saying that those who know the ways of Yahweh have peace within their life. They shall have no occasion of stumbling. If our spiritual life is dysfunctional, if we're not at any given time experiencing the balance, well, that's an improvement. Thank you. If we're not experiencing the spiritual balance that we need, if we're not having a functional and active and two-way relationship with our Heavenly Father, then we're really suffering because we don't have that guidance, we don't have that light within us. And that disparity between where we want to be, we all aspire to be very spiritual, balanced people with that close relationship with Almighty Yahweh. And yet life does everything it can to keep us from doing that. And I say life, but really we attribute it to Satan the adversary, because he's going to do anything he can to disrupt that and increase that disparity. He doesn't want us to be faithful children of Yahweh. But as that disparity increases, so does our stress level. Another cause of stress in the home that's internal is addictions. And we talked about this at the men's retreat here last winter. And we discussed how addictions, one of the most destructive aspects of addiction is when someone's suffering from an addiction internally and they're trying to hide it from the rest of the family. If it's a chemical addiction or a social addiction, whatever it is, if you're not dealing with it and working with it and coming together as a family to strengthen the one who's suffering inside the house, that's a huge source of internal stress, especially to the one who's doing the hiding, but it's also a source of the stress of the people around them who know what's going on and can't address it because that person isn't sharing, and they're realizing they're going to have to confront the issue before they can start working on it. And the third thing I have down here is unresolved issues. We have that happen in a lot of homes. If we have a situation where a spouse may have went outside the confines of the marriage and broke the trust, if a family member breaks the trust of the family, even though the family may welcome that person back into the home and be working through the issues, the fact that it's an unresolved issue in the home can cause a lot of stress, and that can happen very internally into our hearts and minds. And then finally, our mental health, which sometimes is as simple as a chemical imbalance. Sometimes we need to be counseled through something. But also our physical health. If we're suffering pain or discomfort, that can cause a lot of stress within us too. So, I lost the clock back there, guys. Thanks. That's all right. I'm good. I'll just keep talking until somebody stops me. The real thing that we need to talk about here is addressing how to work through, how to manage all of those things. And I probably spent too long introducing them, so I'm going to have to hurry a little bit as we talk about working through them. But I wanted to present you with an idea, and it's called developing a stress border. Developing a stress border. And we're going to use this concept of borders or separation to give ourselves the primary tool on how we're going to manage through stress. We have to look at our families as though we're a nation. A nation's described by a territory that has a border that distinguishes it from the surrounding territories. A stress border is something that we create to protect our families. Now, a proper functioning border is not necessarily a wall, and we know who's going to pay for it. But a functioning I knew the Trump joke would get a laugh, so I couldn't resist. So a functioning border is a border that has the way for there to be trade and communication between the two territories. And that's how we have to envision our stress border. There's a separation, a demarcation between our family and the outside influences of stress. But even though we have to go through that border to go and to do our work and to interact with our communities, we have to be able to define our borders. And what does every good border need is really good border control agents. So let's talk about defining our border and then putting border control in place. In order to do that, we'll roll back and look at those factors that we just talked about. And maybe for the sake of time, I'll just break down one of those. And let's talk about the outside stress factor of our work and how that can create stress in the home. And then we'll talk about defining a stress border to create that separation, and then what our border agents are. For those of us who have that very conventional model of the father going out and making the living and interacting with his job and then bringing that job home and creating stress in the home, we have to be very aware of what our stress border is. And that border is going to be making sure that the job stays at the job and that our home life is protected from the outside influence of the job. The greatest key for that, and what I've learned, there's a great book by Tim Ferriss. I didn't put this in the notes and I didn't get it for the resource table, but Tim Ferriss wrote this book called The 4-Hour Workweek. And Tim's premise is that if we were able to work at our maximum efficiency as an employee, we would be able to do our entire week of work in 4 very productive hours. In other words, in 10% of our time, we're at our most productive. And if we stayed at that most productive level, we would be able to accomplish our entire week's production in those 4 hours. Doesn't always apply, but for those in office positions, it really is an effective way to analyze what you do. Because what you want to do is find those times where you are most effective and then apply that paradigm to the rest of your week. And what you find out is you become very much more productive. But one of the things that Tim talks about is bringing your work home and how much stress that causes you. What he sets forth in the book is that the simple mechanism of time management at the job can really wipe out most of the stress that otherwise would come home with you. What do I mean by that? He focuses on setting aside and really treasuring the last 30 minutes of your day. So if you clock out at 4:30 to go home, try to complete your normal schedule by 4 o'clock and really carve out the last 30 minutes of your day just to accomplish a certain set of mechanisms. Those include going back over everything that you were able to do that day and just kind of checking off that everything was wrapped up and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And then, for the second half of the period, go over the things that you're working for on tomorrow, the things that you know are coming. Perhaps your tasks for the next day, the things that were left undone today that are going to have to be wrapped up tomorrow. But if you go through and catalog those things, and actually, basically, he calls it putting them to bed. If you put those things to bed, now you're able to leave them at the office when you leave. You're not still worrying about them. You're not still dealing with them. And if you've wrapped up everything that you were working on today, you're not going to get that 6 o'clock phone call from the client who happens to be on the West Coast because you didn't get done the information that they were looking for. So things like that are mechanisms to keep the job at the job. But how do we establish the stress border? How do we make sure that we're protecting the sanctity of our home and making sure that we don't have those things encroaching into our home life? The idea is of using border control agents. How does your job encroach into your home? I'll say there's 3 ways, and 2 of them come with the stupid smartphone, right? Because if you're still getting emails and still checking emails at home, your mind is not with the family, you're not present, you're still at work. And if you're getting phone calls, your mind is not with the family, you're still at work. And I'm going to make excuses for myself because I have a job that's essentially I'm on call 24 hours a day. So I feel like I need to keep looking at my phone, and I've had to really put these structures in place to just put it away, actually leave it in another room. I'll look at it one time before I go to bed to make sure that nothing, went wrong that I need to deal with, and I just try to get it away. I've been working on this a lot, especially in the last couple months, and my kids would probably say, Dad, you're not doing a good job. The third thing is the toughest, and that is turning off the machine. Stop thinking about work. Stop bringing the job into the home. And that can be as simple as us talking about work with our family, because that's where we've just spent the whole day. And guess what? Newsflash, they really don't care. They really don't care what we were dealing with, because they've been dealing with things, our spouses especially, they've had a day too. So when we bring the job, oh, you're never going to believe what Jim did at work today. Oh, it was so bad. And you go on for 40 minutes, you've wasted 40 minutes of her time, and the whole time all she hears is, wah, 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 wah. She could care less. If we employ those border agents, we can really clearly make a demarcation between that outside factor and the internal sanctity of our home. The reality we have to face is that all of those outside factors that I listed from outside the home, all of those, our finances, our time commitments, school, the pressure on our teenagers, we have to go through the exercise of deciding in each one of those, what is our stress border? How are we going to define the separation between that stress factor and our life? And then what border control agent are we going to put in place? For example, finances. The border that we should place around our finances is to live within our means. And the border control agent that we can use would be a budget. Just get a budget and stick to the budget. School. We can make sure that our children are treating school the same way that we treat our job, that they're leaving school at school and not bringing the drama into the house and not bringing home so much homework that they can't participate with the family. Inside the home, it's a little bit more difficult to talk about borders, but the things that I listed, like family issues, like teenager issues, the border has to be a commitment from everyone to participate inside the family unit. And then the border control mechanism will become very obvious. Those dysfunctional relationships, we have to create separation so that even though we may have a responsibility or we may have something that has gone off the rails, we just make a decision that we're not going to let that come into and disrupt the peace, the sanctity of our home, and so on. And then even internally, those internal stress factors that I talked about, those are the hardest to create borders on, because in reality, just like what you're dealing with is all in your mind, you almost have to put that stress border in place in your mind and say, this is how I'm going to approach this, and I'm not going to let this affect me the rest of the day. People talk about having their joy stolen. We can't let our joy be stolen by circumstances that we're creating in our own minds. So for men, a little easier than for women to compartmentalize and just put something aside, build a border around it, and then create a border control agent. But it can be done. And it's the only way that we're going to find that peace and stress-free environment within our own lives. If there are issues in the home that are going to take help, we have to be able to get that help. There is counseling available, both from our pastors, but also from social counselors that are available to us in various forms. When it comes to things like addiction, the family can help creating a stress border around an addiction issue by creating a judgment-free zone so that the person suffering from the issue knows that they're not going to face the judgment of their family, but they're going to have the support of their family. The idea is for us to put effort in. And the little booklet that we prepared for you is not going to give you all the tools to do, but I hope that you take it and follow the framework that I presented. I want to spend a little time talking about how to handle the impact of those stress factors. And the concept I want you to think about is diffusing stress factors. Imagine a bomb, in the old, Tom and Jerry bomb, got a little Acme bomb there with a big fuse on it. The fuse is lit and it's burning down and it's ready to go boom. Diffusing a stress factor just means pulling the fuse out so that there is no explosion. And you can discard that fuse and there's really no damage. When we diffuse stress, what we're doing is taking the impact of something that's coming towards us. For a light, for example, in a television studio, you have a light diffuser. So the intense light doesn't shine right on the talent's face. I love calling myself the talent. So we use these light diffusers so that I don't have a spotlight on my face, but it spreads the light apart and makes it a more soft glow. You can have a seawall out in the ocean. You have big waves that are coming in, crashing against that seawall, and the seawall diffuses the energy. So when we diffuse the stress factors, we're taking something that's heading our way and it's going to have an impact on us, and we're kind of spreading it out so that we can deal with it a little bit easier. As I said, there's 4 mechanisms that we have as reactionary as human beings for diffusing stress and stress factors that are coming our way. Just to review, those were avoiding, coping, dealing, and managing. We talked about avoiding stress. We know that that's not really a reality. It's going to be there, and if you're avoiding it, you're just ignoring it. That doesn't help solve anything. If you're coping, that usually leads to some sort of destructive behavior. People will attribute their worst habits, alcoholism, smoking, drug use. Those typically are rooted in someone's desire to or need to cope with stress that's coming towards them. It's interesting, just this last week, we have a database system at work that manages all the clients that are in my district. It actually manages the whole cooperative. And I have moved outside of that database and created Solomon's database. And I was talking to my supervisor and my coordinator at the office, and they labeled that as my coping mechanism. Because the larger database is so unwieldy and not functioning properly, Solomon's created a coping database over here where he can manage it and control it. And it really fed into what I was doing, because how often do we face a really difficult situation and then we create some sort of artificial crutch to get around having to face that straight on? That's not an effective way of working through this. And saying that we're dealing with things, which is typically my answer, I'm dealing with it, it's really just putting it back. You're just pushing it back. And that's not diffusing the stress factor, it's just really delaying its impact. That doesn't help. So when we talk about managing stress factors, it really can be summed up in this, is that by managing a stress factor, we're coming up with a strategy so that we can address it in a healthy way. We're addressing it in a productive way. We're addressing it in a way that's actually going to resolve a situation. You need to have a strategy. Sometimes the strategies are very simple. I know my mom used to say, "Did you count to 10?" Because I'd get all stressed out about the way my older brothers, present company excluded, were treating me. And she would say, "Did you count to 10?" Because Mom, they told me to. Did you count to 10? And I never knew what she meant. But you know what? As I've gotten older, that's not just a saying. We literally can help ourselves a lot if we just take a step back from a situation and count to 10. Give yourself some time to get away from the emotion, think about it, find some peace, and now you can, with a clear mind, address the stress factor of your big brother stealing your ice cream. How about this one? This is one I learned, and I keep forgetting it, and then when it works, I'm like, man, why didn't I think of that before? Laughter is the best medicine. And when you're under a tremendous amount of stress, sometimes finding something to distract yourself, like something funny, a joke, funny story, funny television program. I experienced this in a very dramatic way in the years where we were really hitting the pinnacle of our business. And the bigger we got and the more successful we got, the more stress that was on us. And it was like I spent more time trying to protect what we had done than furthering what we were doing. And I remember an incident, and we were under a tremendous amount of stress. We're talking federal regulators walking around with clipboards and just completely stressing us out. And I was sick. I was literally ill from all of the stress that was happening. It was having an effect on me in a very profound way. And I came home like 8:30 at night. And I came in, and Michelle, this is in the summertime, Michelle had let the children watch this insanely stupid program. I think it was called Wipeout. If you've ever seen it, you know how stupid it is. And you're talking about people getting knocked over into mud and tripping and falling, and they think they've got the big prize, and a blast of water hits them and they go flying off into the pool. Really funny. I mean, if you're in a bad place, something that stupid where you don't have to think and you're able to just laugh and enjoy yourself, it had a huge impact on me. I kind of felt invigorated from that half an hour of watching someone else going through something that was just silly, and it just gave me a whole bunch of energy to continue going on. So be able to find those circumstances to laugh. But the biggest way of managing stress, and the biggest tool that I want you to use, is the theme of this conference, which is take some time out. Those two tools that I just mentioned just are a way of using time in order to diffuse a situation. Counting to 10, watching a funny television program. Go take a shower when you get home. Take a hot shower and just kind of forget that everything else is going on for like 10 minutes. Spend some time with the kids. Get one of your little kids or grandkids to give you a hug and tell you about something that you could care less about otherwise, and suddenly it's very important. That's a great way to take a time out. My reality check is that all of those things are great, but we still need more tools. And I can't stand up here and tell you what's going to work for you. I know what works for me. I know that we get into circumstances that we're not prepared for. I think of, there's a sister, I used to call her my sister. She worked as a nurse, and she came and moved into our area and just was thrust into a situation where, after she had been there for about a year, the company hired a new supervisor for her department. And this new supervisor didn't understand how that department ran. She didn't understand the lay of the land. She didn't understand the patients. She didn't understand the administration. And she kept forcing the employees into these circumstances that they knew were non-productive and, in fact, were taking everything backwards. And my sister was all stressed out about this. I mean, it was just wrecking her life. And we were talking, and she and her husband and I, gave her this advice at the time, and it ended up being her salvation in that circumstance, which is that we asked her to just come at things a different way. So the best tool that we can have to diffuse stress is really, as I said, take a step back and then change your position so that you find a new perspective. In her case, she started working with that supervisor, taking time after work, explaining to her and showing her how that department had functioned up to that point, explaining things, taking the time. Little did she know that that person had just been brought in as a temporary step to an administrative position. They weren't intended to be a nurse supervisor at all. They just put her in there so she could learn the workings of the hospital. And because of what she did, when that person was moved up the ladder 6 months later, she became the nursing supervisor, a position she still holds. When we take a step out of the stress situation and take a new look at things, many times we find the greatest reward and the solution that we've been seeking all along in that circumstance. In conclusion, I want to just give you a little mnemonic to remember, and those are 3 C's. I think they're in your booklet, but 3 C's that you can use for handling stress inside of the family. The first is clear boundaries. We're going to have a presentation on boundaries later this weekend, but establish those stress borders. Just decide, these are not my monkeys and this is not my circus. This does not have a place in our family. So when you have those borders pronounced, defined, and functioning, then you're insulating your family from those stress factors. The second is communication. Without exception, the stress situations that are inside of your home are caused by the lack of the next two, which is communication and cooperation. So we can easily keep things outside of the home, but what we're doing as a family unit and functioning inside the family can be done so much better when there's proper communication and cooperation within the family unit. So as a family, you can sit down and decide, how are we going to approach these circumstances? How are we going to manage through these situations? And then are we going to be sure not to let things get out of hand inside the families? Inside families, you have to just stop the crazy sometime. It can really get out of hand. Everybody's going in a lot of different directions, and the real key is to take the time. The answer for all of these things is found in one of my favorite passages of Scripture, which is in Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. Paul wrote to the Philippian assembly, "Be anxious for nothing." Be anxious for nothing. When we understand the redemption that we have through the shed blood of our Savior, Yahshua the Messiah, when we understand that Yahweh has a plan for us that He's working out, and that His plan goes from the time of creation to the time when the kingdom's established, and that there's very little about any of that we can affect, and we realize that we're just a small, microscopic part of that greater plan working out, it should give us peace. And that's what Paul wrote. He said, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving." We talk about the value of family devotionals, coming together around the supper table as our family altar, reading the Bible, sharing the history of our families. My kids have this, and I haven't done it for a while, but the littler children, they had this option at the end of Friday evening when it was time for bed, and it was a Bible story, a funny story, or something that happened in our family. And sometimes I could work a funny story in that happened in our family, and sometimes it was related to the Bible. I could bring all three together. But if you just take those precious moments, and I've really fallen down in recent years. I started when Melissa was just little and she wouldn't settle down. And I started making these stories up because I didn't have a storybook right there to read her. So, and she was a little kid, she could care less. So I would just make up these stories. They were called rabbit stories. And to this day, if I told the kids, I'm going to do a rabbit story, all 6 of them, including Melissa, would come and run and jump on the bed and just be like, ready for the rabbit story. You take those moments, you make a memory like we heard last night. Those things are so valuable, and they're such a stress diffuser because now you're spreading the stress that you might be feeling and not pushing it onto the rest of the family, but now as a family, you're sharing what one person is dealing with. So we do so with thanksgiving to Yahweh. We thank Him for the things that we have. And then to conclude the verse, he says, "Let your requests be made known to Yahweh, and the peace of Yahweh, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in the Messiah Yahshua." Now that's what we all want, right? We don't want to take time out from stress, but what we really want is that peace that's beyond all understanding. Because when we're inside the loving arms of our Savior, when we're under the pinion, the covering protection of our Father Yahweh, we have that peace. I don't believe there's going to be stress in the kingdom of Yahweh. So we can work today to take time out for stress.